early on in trying to figure out what they were seeing as far as these patterns, in particular with how electrons found their orbits around a nucleus, and that it seemed to be that there were only certain orbits, or what become called orbitals, that they would be in. The question was why? Why is it only here and not there? And what is the mechanism by which it moves from one to the other? And ultimately, I believe it was Heisenberg just said, you know what? Maybe we can't figure that out. Maybe what we do is we just do careful observations of what we see. And then with that, he built like these probability matrices that then they could use in equations to get the kinds of results that they needed that turned out to be extremely accurate. But ultimately, it's based off of observations of what we can see, not necessarily understanding the mechanism behind it. And isn't that very interesting that this is kind of like what we're seeing here with the Tao? Welcome to Kinship Cafe. I am your host, Jim Jones, and I'm so glad you decided to join us today. We're going to be continuing now with Chapter 4 of the Daodejing. So let's begin by reading through the chapter. Tao is empty, its use never exhausted, bottomless, the origin of all things. It blunts sharp objects, unties knots, softens glare, becomes one with the dusty world. Deeply subsistent, I don't know whose child it is. It is older than the ancestor. And again, this is the Addiss and Lombardo translation we've been working with. So let's go ahead and step through this. I'll probably start by saying that at the core, what I think we see happening here is in Chapter 2 and Chapter 3, we've really challenged this idea of values in the sense of human or socially constructed ways of dividing things like good and evil, as opposed to natural opposites like long and short, whereas something like long and short are complementary to each other. The human-derived values of things like good and evil are actually at war with each other. And so there's this movement to remove those filters from our eyes for how we see reality, because again, core and central to the Taoist perspective is to see clearly what is. How is the world, so that we can move in step with it, that we can move in harmony with that, as opposed to going against the principles or patterns that we see happening within nature itself. So in Chapter 4, then, what I think we see is part of how that shift in perspective takes place, how we're able to see or perceive, let's say, the world apart from those value judgments. And so let's kind of step through this again, line by line, and we'll start to look at how this chapter allows that shift in perspective to happen. So in the first verse here, it says, Tao is empty. And I'm going to bring in another translation here from Chan that I think really helps to kind of bring out a little bit of this point a little bit here. It says, Tao functions through its nothingness. So here we kind of come to a very interesting piece of Taoism that we see throughout a lot of the text, is it's trying to shift our focus from, you might say, the foreground to the background. That what's right in front of us isn't necessarily, it's maybe the thing that normally catches our attention, but we're not paying attention to what's going on around it, or maybe that negative space, that empty space. And so we're urged to kind of recognize that when we're thinking about Tao, we're thinking about something that's kind of operating in this negative space. If we think about early on in Chapter 1, the contrast between absence and presence, and really it was kind of more this idea of formlessness and form, that it was all kind of one thing. But when we're thinking from the form perspective, there we tend to apply names or categories that make them seem like distinct and separate things, when in fact it's actually all different manifestations of that one thing. So here, that absence, that emptiness, that nothingness is being kind of brought into focus as where we want to start to look at what is our reality, what is our context that we find ourselves in. And much like chapter 1, where there's this idea of the Tao at the end as a gate, something that can go through, here we have this idea of, in that first line where it says Tao is empty, it's actually a word that, or a character that means like bottomless cup. And I'm not sure if they meant this like figuratively, metaphorically, or if they had some kind of something that would just be continuously refilled. I'm not sure. But in any case, they have this idea that you can't use it up, right? It's never exhausted. And then it goes on to say that it's bottomless. It's actually the origin of everything. And again, just like what we saw in chapter 1, where it says absence names the mother of 10,000, or the origin of 10,000 things. So here it can't be used up. The gate, you go through it as many times as you want, it doesn't use it up. Here it's like this bottomless cup, there's no way to use it up. So that's kind of a key thing that we want to keep in mind, is that whereas we are very finite, when we're thinking about the ultimate reality, it is essentially, from our perspective, endless. Of course, if we think about the overall perspective from modern day physics, we can see that, yeah, there is definitely some limitations as far as we can tell, and there's definitely this idea of entropy, but from our personal perspective, it matches well with what the Taoists are talking about, that the cosmic level is bottomless and unexhaustible compared to where we come from. So if we take that then and look at the next part of the chapter, it says, it blunts sharp edges, unties knots, softens glare. And then on this last part of the line, there's really two key ways I see this being translated. One is like it is here in our Addiss and Lombardo, where it says becomes one with the dust of the, becomes one with the dusty world. And I think that what's happening here is in the first couple of lines, it's almost like we've personified the Tao, and that it's taking action, it's doing something here, it's blunting the sharp edges and untying knots and softening glare. So when it talks about becoming one with the dusty world, it seems like it's taking on an attitude of humbleness, right? It's taking that low place. And we can see this also within the Tao when it makes the association with water, that it flows to the lowest place. It goes everywhere that other things don't want to travel. It goes there as water. And so you can see where it kind of gets this idea from. But the other side of this, the other translation that we have here is talking about this idea of dust settling. And I think that makes a little bit more sense with what's happening with those first three, because we kind of have these opposites again, that, you know, sharp and blunt, tied up and untied, glaring and, you know, not glaring, dimmed, let's say. And so the idea then of settling the dust, you have this idea of stirred up and then settled. And I think that makes a little bit more sense in the context of this passage. So what are we seeing here then? Now we're starting to get into the perspective shift. So when it's talking about blunting sharp edges, this isn't like, you know, the Tao's coming in and taking action. It's saying over time, something that's sharp is going to become dull. Over time, knots or tangles or messes seem to undo, or they just disappear. Glare changes. The sun's in your eyes, but then it sets. And then something stirs up the dust. Over time, the dust settles. And I think that here what we're seeing is that in a long enough time frame, you not only have this idea like entropy, that things kind of go from one extreme to the other, you also have the whole idea that things kind of come into existence and then go out of existence. They kind of talk about that as returning back to the source, that movement from absence to presence back to absence again. And definitely within that realm of the presence of with form, you've got the yin-yang balances that are happening, that are constantly moving. And the point is that nothing is fixed, nothing is static, everything is in transition, everything is impermanent. And so when we get caught up on the immediate moment of what something is like, it can be tempting for us to draw those kind of judgments about what this means. But when we step back and we see things from a longer perspective or more of a cosmic perspective, we start to see, this is just an ebb and flow that continues to happen, and it's ongoing, and it's not good or bad. It just is. And that's probably one of the core things we're getting here, is when we're thinking about the Tao and these patterns and how they operate in the natural way, the self-so way, it just seems to unfold where it doesn't stay in one way. It will change from, the sharp to the blunt, from something that seems like a tangled mess to something that seems like it doesn't even matter anymore. All these things with time change. So that's probably one of the biggest perception shifts that happen within Taoism, and especially in terms of thinking about is something good or bad, is taking that perspective of a longer time frame. So let's look then at the next part of this. Our translation says that it's deeply subsistent. And I'm bringing in another translation here to kind of fill that out a little bit. It says it's so still and clear, it seems to barely be present. And that's kind of what's being very minimalistically described in our Addiss and Lombardo translation. But it's this idea that, we use gravity as an example all the time here. We can use it again. We can see the effects of gravity. We see things fall, but we don't see gravity itself. And that's, I think, what's being got at here, is that there's these patterns that are recognized within reality that we can't quite see them. Like, we see the results, we understand what happens, and we have theories to understand why those things happen, but we can't see something like gravity. But we understand how it works. And that's part of what I think they're saying about the Tao, is it's imperceptible, but yet we can see the results of it. Oddly enough, quick little detour, this is kind of what's happened even in a modern context when we think about quantum mechanics. Early on in trying to figure out what they were seeing as far as these patterns, in particular with how electrons found their orbits around a nucleus, and that it seemed to be that there were only certain orbits, or what become called orbitals, that they would be in. The question was, why? Why is it only here and not there? And what is the mechanism by which it moves from one to the other? And ultimately, I believe it was Heisenberg just said, you know what? Maybe we can't figure that out. Maybe what we do is we just do careful observations of what we see. And then with that, he built these probability matrices that then they could use in equations to get the kinds of results that they needed, that turned out to be extremely accurate. But ultimately, it's based off of observations of what we can see, not necessarily understanding the mechanism behind it. And isn't that very interesting, that this is kind of like what we're seeing here with the Tao? There's patterns, we recognize them, we see them, but we can't see the Tao. We can't see the actual patterns. It's as if it's so clear it barely seems present. And that brings us then to the last part of the chapter. And it starts off by saying, I don't know whose child it is. Now this is getting at, where did it come from? And by saying, I don't know whose child it is, it's in a sense saying, it's just there. It didn't come from anything. A concept within Taoism is this idea of self-so, that it is. And what does that mean? What does it mean that it's foundational in that sense, that it doesn't derive from anything, that it's not from anything else? Well, it means in a certain sense there's nothing you can appeal to above it. And it continues here in the end of the chapter by saying it is older than the ancestor. And that's again in our Addiss and Lombardo translation. So what ancestor is being translated here is actually this character for D, which is evidently a god that was associated, I believe, with the Shang dynasty. And that character, or that deity, was what gave that legitimacy to the empire. And so by saying this is even older than that, older than the oldest of the ancestors or what becomes deities within that Chinese way of thinking, it's saying, it's making a claim about authority or legitimacy. This isn't like some new idea. It's not some novel concept. This is something with antiquity, with something that goes back. And in this case, it goes all the way back. There's nothing further. It just is at the beginning, so to speak. So here you go. Some very interesting concepts in this chapter that help us to have a different perspective, a shift in our perspective that maybe helps us to see more clearly the world as it is, to avoid those value judgments that happen by being too close in our perspective to the present moment. So I hope you found this an interesting exploration of this chapter of the Daodejing. If you did, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. If you'd like even more information, you can go to our website, www.kinship.cafe, and you can sign up for our newsletter, in which case we will send out invitations to the live Zoom presentation of this information where you can dialogue and interact with others. Or if you happen to be in the Southern California area, you can join us for our in-person meetings on Sunday mornings. So hope to see you there, and take care.